An elderly millionaire was humiliated by police for looking poor. What he did next destroyed their lives without saying a word. He was found slumped on a bench outside the municipal flower market, hunched beneath a threadbare gray coat, his shoes soft with wear and his breath forming a frail mist in the winter air. To the flower vendor who called the police, he seemed just another unfortunate soul left behind by time, gaunt, disoriented, mumbling to himself in fragmented Latin. 2 officers arrived, more irritated by the cold than concerned about the man. When they nudged him awake and asked for identification, he handed over a card so old and faded that the ink had nearly vanished. They glanced at it, unimpressed, and placed him gently yet firmly into the back of the cruiser. He didn't resist. He simply whispered something that made no sense to them. "Her fever broke this morning. Let me bring her the jasmine." At the precinct, no one believed he was Edward Alcott, the banking magnate who once owned half the steel mills along the northern coast. There were no rings on his fingers, no wallet thick with cards, no phone, just that gray coat and a scent of wilted lilies clinging to the lining. By the time they had run his fingerprints and confirmed the impossible truth, a quiet hush had fallen over the station. Reporters had started calling, and the police commissioner was informed. Edward Alcott hadn't been seen publicly in nearly 4 years. Everyone had assumed he'd quietly retreated to one of his many estates abroad, living out his final days in the kind of seclusion only immense wealth could afford. Instead, he had been here, alone. But Edward's tale was far stranger than his appearance. For in his silence was hidden a story not of madness, but of sacrifice. Earlier that week, he had been spotted walking through the industrial district, clutching a bouquet of pale jasmine. A local grocer had given him a bag of oranges, and in exchange, he'd recited a poem in ancient Greek. The grocer's daughter, an undergraduate at the university, had been so charmed by the man's eccentricity that she followed him discreetly. She watched him enter an unmarked brick building, the kind of place that didn't exist on any official registry. Inside, behind locked doors, lay a woman in a hospital bed. Her name was Elaine. She was once a celebrated pianist and Edward's wife of 43 years. For the past 7, she had been battling a rare neurodegenerative disease. The kind of illness that only the most experimental treatments might delay, and only if one had the means to fund clinical trials not yet sanctioned by any medical board. Edward had such means. He had sold off assets discreetly, funding research in laboratories that preferred to keep their names off the books. No media attention, no announcements. Only desperation and love. He no longer held properties, no longer hosted banquets for ambassadors or signed checks with his embossed fountain pen. He had exchanged his empire for time, time for Elaine. And for a while, it had worked. That very morning, before the police picked him up, Elaine had opened her eyes and called him by name. Her fever had broken, and for the first time in months, she recognized the jasmine he brought. That was why he had wandered into the city, into the biting wind, to find more, to celebrate. The press, of course, had a field day. They spun their theories, speculated about secret cults and offshore laundering. Some called him mad, others called him a martyr. But no one, not even the officers who had detained him, could reconcile the man in the gray coat with the legend in the headlines. Then came the inquiry. The officers who had brought him in were summoned by Internal Affairs. Why had they detained an elderly man showing clear signs of illness without contacting emergency services? Why had they failed to recognize him, despite the database match? A quiet scandal brewed, just enough to ensure their early retirements. But that was only the beginning. Because Edward Alcott's disappearance had not been as unnoticed as many believed. There were whispers, among pharmaceutical boards, among venture capitalists, about a vast fortune that had vanished overnight. An anonymous fund had poured billions into obscure medical trials. When investigators tried to trace the source, the trail always ended in silence. Now they knew. And someone else was watching. Someone who had been waiting for Edward to emerge. For with Elaine's recovery came not only relief, but consequences. The kind of consequences that no one, not even Edward Alcott, could have foreseen. The jasmine was only the beginning. The news of Edward Alcott's reappearance, bedraggled and barely standing, spread with the quiet force of a storm that brews beneath calm skies. The financial world stirred uneasily. Men in windowless rooms opened sealed envelopes. Numbers began to vanish from ledgers that had been untouched for years. In the private vaults beneath the Mercantile Reserve of Zurich, a red file labeled Dormant Trust E. Alcott REF. Vesta 9-inch. Triggered an automated alert. An algorithm scanned Edward's biometric reactivation and, following the irrevocable protocol set a decade prior, executed a silent transfer of funds, $700 million, gone in less than a second, split into 13 accounts, each tied to a separate string of ciphers and coordinates. And in a laboratory on the outskirts of Helsinki, a woman named Dr. Margarete Voss received an encrypted message on a device she thought long decommissioned. Her eyes narrowed as she read the line. She woke up. Initiate sequence thalassa. Meanwhile, Edward sat in the pale blue waiting room of St. Aurelia's Neurological Institute. Elaine was being examined. A nurse had taken her blood while she hummed softly, Chopin, if he was not mistaken. It was the first time she had played anything, even with her lips, in nearly 2 years. Edward clutched the fabric of his coat with trembling fingers. The jasmine still rested in his pocket, now dried and fragile. He hadn't slept in days, hadn't eaten in longer. The officers had released him quietly, with formal apologies and carefully worded statements. But he hadn't cared. All he wanted was to be by Elaine's side. But the moment peace had appeared, so too did shadows. That morning, while he sipped from a paper cup of bitter coffee, a man sat beside him. He was middle-aged, with the air of someone who knew too much and spoke too little. His suit was impeccable. No scent. No badge. Just a pale gray folder, and the kind of eyes that had witnessed too many endings. "I trust you know what you've triggered," the man said without looking at him. Edward stared ahead. "I triggered nothing. I saved my wife." The man offered the faintest smile, as though hearing a child insist that fire doesn't burn. "You activated the fund. The dormant vaults. Sequence thalassa was never just about her, Edward. It was about all of them." Edward's heart thudded in his chest. "What do you mean, them? You gave over your entire fortune, yes. But not just to treat her. You signed off on experimentation, on trials that never sought approval because you paid for silence. Do you even know what she was injected with?" "I trusted the researchers." The man laughed gently. "No, Edward. You trusted desperation." Edward turned now, truly looking at the stranger for the first time. There was a scar beneath his eye, almost surgical. The kind you don't notice until it's too late. "Who are you?" "Think of me," the man said, rising, "as your final auditor." And then he was gone. At that same hour, across the city, a fire alarm rang inside a high-security biotech facility. The blaze had started not in the lab, but in the server room. Files encrypted under Alcott's name were wiped clean. Backup tapes melted. What had once been the most confidential project in experimental neurology, Project Thalassa, was now nothing more than smoke and ashes. That evening, Elaine spoke her first full sentence in years. She looked at Edward with clear, calm eyes and said, "They'll come for us." He froze. "Who?" But she only smiled faintly, the way she used to when hiding surprise behind dignity. "I don't remember their names. But I remember the pain." Edward sat back, shaken. There were fragments of something dark behind her words, memories not fully returned, or perhaps buried for a reason. He could feel the shape of the storm ahead. That night, 3 things happened in rapid succession. A junior analyst at a Swiss bank discovered an inconsistency in a long inactive account tied to Alcott's trusts, and vanished the next morning without a trace. A nurse from St. Aurelia's named Petra Corman downloaded Elaine's full medical file onto a private flash drive. She had worked under Dr. Margarete Voss once, before being fired for unexplained breaches in protocol. Elaine dreamt for the first time in 7 years. And in her dream, she stood in a white hallway, hearing voices call her name, not voices of the living, but echoes from the deep past. Edward sat beside her bed, watching her sleep, unaware that his greatest sacrifice had not bought peace. It had bought time. And time, as he would soon learn, was more dangerous than anything he had ever traded. The letter arrived in the morning mail, although no courier remembered delivering it. It was placed neatly atop the newspaper outside Edward Alcott's modest rented flat, nestled in a forgotten corner of the old quarter, where the cobblestones still whispered the secrets of older lives. The envelope was unlike anything he had seen, midnight velvet with no seal, no name, and no handwriting. Only a golden thread, looped thrice, binding it shut. Edward hesitated before opening it. There was a time he had opened bank drafts for more than most men earned in a lifetime without blinking. Now, a letter made his hands tremble. Inside was a single phrase, printed in calligraphic ink. The price was not yours alone to pay. There was no signature. No return address. But the moment he read the words, the faint hum in the back of his mind, present ever since Elaine's awakening, began to grow louder. He had assumed it was stress. Guilt, perhaps. But now the sound resolved into something darker, like a distant chord from an instrument long out of tune. He turned to Elaine, who sat quietly by the window, knitting with impossible patience. Her hands moved deftly, rhythmically, yet Edward noticed something peculiar. Her gaze was fixed not on her work, but on the sky, empty, gray, and strange. "Elaine," he said softly, "do you feel different?" She paused, her needles midair. "I remember everything now," she whispered. "And I wish I didn't." He moved closer. "What do you mean?" She turned to him, and for the briefest moment, her eyes, those green, intelligent eyes, shimmered not with light, but with something metallic. Artificial. "I remember the trial," she continued, voice steady, almost rehearsed. "The dark room. The glass dome. The voices that weren't human. They said they were preserving me, Edward. But I was never asleep. I was aware. Buried beneath myself." Edward felt a coldness seep through his spine. "But I paid for the best doctors, the most advanced researchers. They were trying to help." "No," she interrupted, her tone suddenly sharper. "They were building something. I wasn't the only one." He sat down slowly. "They lied to me." "No," she corrected. "You paid them to lie. You asked them to save me?" "They said yes. But they never said how." That afternoon, he went to the old warehouse again, the same brick building where Elaine had been kept. He found it abandoned, its windows shattered and walls scorched. Scattered among the ash were fragments of machinery he couldn't recognize, curved steel that pulsed faintly when touched, as if remembering heat, or thought. In a corner, half buried beneath the rubble, he found a rusted clipboard. On the back of a document labeled Patient 1E, someone had scribbled a chilling note. "Conscious during cryostasis. Euro bridge attempted. Failed containment. Time breach risk unknown." As Edward stared at the words, he felt the silence around him shift. Something moved behind the crumbled wall. Not a person, something else. Something low, and breathing. He didn't wait to see. He ran. But the past ran faster. That night, as he locked every door and double-checked every window, he heard a soft knock. 3 raps, measured. Deliberate. He didn't answer. It came again, but from the back door. Then the side window. Then the attic. The knocks steady, encircling the house like a ritual. At exactly midnight everything went still. Elaine stood in the hallway, staring at the front door. Her knitting had fallen at her feet. Her hands were trembling. "He's here," she whispered. "Who?" Edward asked. But she said nothing. Only stared, as the door began to creak open, though no one stood behind it. Only wind. And jasmine. The door hung open for several minutes. Nothing crossed the threshold. No footsteps, no voices, just a gust of cold air and the distinct, lingering scent of jasmine. The same scent Edward had carried in his coat pocket the day Elaine awakened. But it was stronger now. Thick, almost suffocating, like a perfume from another time. Elaine stepped backward without turning away, as if her body remembered something her mind had not yet explained. Edward reached for her hand, but she recoiled, eyes still fixed on the empty doorway. "He's not a man anymore," she whispered. "Not really." "Who?" Edward asked again, and this time his voice cracked under the strain. Elaine turned to him at last. "They called him Patient Zero. He was the first to cross." Edward stared, baffled. "Cross what?" But before she could answer, the lights dimmed. Not all at once, just a slow, deliberate fading, as though the house itself were being peeled from reality. The refrigerator hummed its last, the clock stopped ticking, and even the air seemed to lose weight. Then, at the center of the darkened living room, a shape began to form. It wasn't sudden, nor entirely visible. It shimmered at the edges, like heat rising from a road, and within it stood a figure, tall, still, and dressed in a hospital gown that looked charred at the seams. His head was shaved, his skin translucent. No shadow fell from his feet, and where his eyes should have been were only two small circles of quiet light. Edward stood frozen. Elaine said nothing. The figure took a step forward, noiselessly, and raised its hand, not to threaten, but to beckon. Then it spoke, not aloud, but within them. "You opened the gate." Edward's breath caught. He recognized the voice, not from life, but from a recording he had once watched in a sterile Zurich laboratory. A trial subject had spoken similar words before their vitals flatlined. The researchers had called it phantom cognition, a phenomenon they swore wasn't real. Just electrical noise, they said. But Edward remembered the final frame of that video, a man with glowing eyes and no heartbeat, sitting up on the table after death. Elaine stepped forward. "I remember you," she said softly. "You are the echo of the breach," the figure answered. Edward finally found his voice. "What is happening? What breach?" The figure turned its luminous gaze to him, and a flood of images pierced his mind, lab doors slamming shut, men in hazmat suits collapsing, neural scans turning into sound waves, and a scream that traveled through metal. He fell to his knees, clutching his head, gasping. "You bought time with blood," the voice whispered in his skull. "But the ledger was never balanced." Elaine knelt beside him. "What does it want?" she asked, barely breathing. The figure turned back to her. "Completion." Then it vanished. No sound. No light. Just gone. The power surged back with a violent hum. The lights flickered on. The clock resumed its ticking, now a second faster than before. Edward sat, shaking, as Elaine stood quietly beside him, her expression unreadable. "I need to tell you everything," she said at last. "About the experiment. About what I saw on the other side." He looked up. "What do you mean, other side of what?" Elaine's voice was calm, almost detached. "Time." She turned and walked toward the study, where the locked drawer held the only remaining file from Project Thalassa, one she had taken without Edward's knowledge. He followed, slowly, still disoriented. As she unlocked the drawer, he noticed something new. The tips of her fingers, barely visible in the light, were glowing. Faintly. Like his did once, long ago. In the final days of the treatment. Before he transferred everything to save her. The folder Elaine retrieved was slimmer than Edward remembered. A dozen pages at most, housed in a matte black sleeve. She laid it on the desk, and for a long moment either of them moved. Rain had begun to tap against the windowpane, soft and rhythmic, like an old code meant only for those who still remembered. Edward reached for the folder with a hesitation he hadn't felt in years, not when signing away factories, not when selling the offshore villas, not even when wiring the final sum to Helsinki's discreet offshore clinic. The documents within weren't printed on standard paper. They had a fine, synthetic sheen, designed to resist degradation. Government grade. The kind of material used when something must survive not just years, but eras. Each page bore a minimalist heading, Philosophy. The first was titled simply, Bridge Theory, Partial Transfer Viability. Elaine spoke as he read, her voice distant, clinical. They believed consciousness could be duplicated across time, not just preserved. Not cryostasis in the physical sense, but something deeper, a preservation of neural identity. A sliver of soul. Edward turned the page. Diagrams, impossibly complex neural lattices, timelines curved inward like coiled springs. Not linear. Not even cyclical. Temporal recursion mapped in protein-coded chains. They started with a test subject, patient 0. A volunteer. Or perhaps a prisoner. No one ever said. Elaine paused. But he crossed further than any of them predicted. His mind wasn't just mirrored, it multiplied. And one version remained in this timeline. The other. She tapped the document. Went somewhere else. Edward looked up, his voice a hoarse whisper. And now it's come back. Elaine gave a slow, solemn nod. It wasn't meant to. But when the treatments began to work, when I started waking, they believed it was because of you. Your connection to me. Your sacrifice. Somehow your will anchored me. But in anchoring me, I reopened the breach. He finished. Elaine slid over the final page. A flat diagram of a body, her own, judging by the medical notations. Along the spine and brainstem were thin red markings labeled T markers. Temporal markers, she said. They grew in me during the coma. Organic beacons. Traces of where I'd been. Of when I'd been. Edward felt a pressure behind his eyes, as if the truth were folding inward. You were gone, he said. Not just asleep. Gone. Yes, she replied. Then, more quietly. And I wasn't alone. Thunder cracked outside, sudden and too close. The lights dimmed again, not fully, but just enough to hint at a presence passing through the wires. Edward rose and crossed the room. He opened the drawer of the side cabinet, retrieving something he'd hidden years ago, a small device, black and circular, etched with symbols no engineer had ever claimed responsibility for. It was a neural stabilizer, given to him by one of the original researchers on the project, just in case the temporal resonance became unstable. He had never needed it. Until now. What are you planning? Elaine asked. I want to understand, he said. If this is what I paid for, if this is what brought you back, I need to see what you saw. Her eyes darkened. That's not a door you can just open and close. Once you see it, feel it, your mind starts to divide. But Edward already knew. He had glimpsed something when the figure spoke to him, fractured images that didn't belong to him, or perhaps hadn't yet. He turned the stabilizer on. It hummed faintly. Elaine stepped back. If you anchor yourself, you might trap something else in here. In you. He nodded. I'd rather carry it than let it follow you. The device activated. A sharp tone rang in his ears, then the world split, not in sight, but in sensation. The room remained. Elaine remained. But another version of the room shimmered around them, dustless, pristine, and silent. In that version, Elaine was still asleep in a hospital bed. Monitors blinked with unreadable data. But behind her, in the corner, stood another Edward, older, gaunter, his eyes dim and his hand resting on a lever connected to a shimmering tube. Then, that Edward turned and looked directly at him. The stabilizer sparked. Edward staggered. He sees me, he gasped. Elaine stepped forward. Then you're not just crossing time, she said. You're colliding with your own ghost. The stabilizer clicked once, then shut off. The images vanished, but Edward's body remained cold. His hands glowed faintly, his fingertips pale and pulsing. Just like Elaine's. Whatever's happening, she said. We're part of a closed loop now. Bound by the same bargain. And in the silence that followed, a new envelope slid under the door. White. Unmarked. Inside, a single sentence. You paid once in gold. Now you will pay in memory. Edward closed his eyes. He remembered things he had never lived. And in a forgotten clinic, a machine blinked to life on its own. Edward did not open the envelope again. He didn't need to. The words had seared themselves into the folds of his mind, you paid once in gold. Now you will pay in memory. And already, he could feel it beginning. It started subtly. A name misplaced here, a moment faded there. He couldn't remember the color of his mother's scarf, or whether the alley near his childhood home turned left or right. But they were just fragments, meaningless details. Until he forgot his father's voice. And then, his brother's face. Elaine watched it happen with a quiet, mournful gaze, not alarmed, but accepting, as if this too had been written in the fine print of the contract either of them had truly read. "You're being taxed," she said. "Not by man or law, but by time itself." He looked up at her. "But why memory?" "Because that's where the breach lives now," she replied. "In what we remember. Or choose to forget." She handed him a photograph, faded, taken decades ago. The two of them at a train station in Budapest, young and weightless. He looked at the image, and though he saw the outlines, his arms around her waist, her chin resting on his shoulder, he felt nothing. The memory was already gone. "They're taking them in sequence," she said. "The most distant first. Soon they'll reach the ones that matter." Edward stood in silence. Then he whispered, "I would give them all. If it meant keeping you." Elaine's hands trembled as she reached for his. "You already have." But the breach was not done. That night, a knock came, not at the door, but on the inside of the mirror. 3 slow taps. They echoed through the house like stone dropped in a dry well. Elaine stood, staring into the glass. Her reflection was delayed, by a second, perhaps 2. When she tilted her head, the woman in the mirror paused, then followed. And behind her, just barely visible in the blurred pane, was a shape. Not a man. Not anymore. "Patient 0. She whispered. The mirror cracked, just a hairline fracture, from corner to corner, like a scar across a face. Edward took her arm. "We need to leave." "No," she said, her voice cold and certain. "We need to go back." "To the clinic?" She shook her head. "To the moment. That moment. The breach point. The last day of her consciousness before the coma. When the treatment had begun." "You said it was a closed loop," he argued. "We can't undo what's already happened." "We don't need to undo it," she replied. "We need to remember it." She retrieved the stabilizer again. But this time, she linked it to another device, one Edward hadn't seen before. It resembled a headset, laced with coils and threads of living metal. She placed it on her head. "This is what they used to map my mind," she explained. "It doesn't just read, it records. We're going to see the memory. Not dream it. Not guess it. Live it." Edward hesitated. Then sat beside her. They synced the devices, hand in hand, as the old neural threads pulsed to life. The machines hummed, but not mechanically. Their rhythm was organic, like breathing. And suddenly time collapsed. They stood in a white chamber. Around them, machines, doctors in muted uniforms, and above it all, the great ring, a spinning gyroscope of memory, orbiting a glass pod. Inside that pod, Elaine. Unmoving. Peaceful. But wrong. Because Edward saw another presence within her. Not a twin. Not a shadow. An observer. It stood silently behind her eyes, feeding on the images of her life like a patient thief. Every memory was watched. That was the truth. The breach had never been about preservation. It had been a harvest. A slow extraction of human memory, each subject's life catalogued, digested, and stored not in databases, but in something ancient. Something that fed on the past. Edward turned to the version of himself standing by the monitors. He was calm, unaware, watching numbers rise on a screen. Elaine took his hand. "This is where it began. This is where we decide whether to let it continue." And just as the past began to blur, the machine above them, the gyroscope of memory, paused. And turned. Toward them. It saw them. And it remembered. The gyroscope stopped spinning. Its metallic arcs, once graceful and abstract, now twisted with purpose, contracting into a single shape, an unblinking eye. No iris, no pupil, just a concentric spiral of moving light. It pulsed with recognition, and something older than language slid into their thoughts. "This moment is fixed," the voice intoned. "And you do not belong." Elaine staggered. Blood trickled from her nose. Edward felt his vision fracture, not blur, fracture, as if reality had become glass under pressure. "We're not here to change the past," he managed to say aloud. "Only to understand it." The eye made no reply. Instead, the chamber around them began to deconstruct. Walls bled data. Chairs flattened into code. Doctors flickered, one by one, like shadows unchosen. Elaine grabbed Edward's arm. "It's collapsing the memory to protect itself." The device on her head sparked, and suddenly, they were standing not in the clinic, but in a field. Dusk. Silence. No machines. Only wild grass and a sky painted in bruised purple. Edward spun, confused. "Where are we?" Elaine stared forward, her voice distant. "My childhood." At the far end of the field stood a swing set. On one of the swings sat a small girl, no older than 7. She looked up and smiled. "That's me." They approached cautiously. The girl didn't move, didn't speak, only smiled at Elaine with familiarity, and something else. Her gaze shifted slightly to Edward, and then narrowed. "Something's wrong," Elaine said. "That's not just a memory. It's—" The sky cracked open. The fracture wasn't lightning or thunder. It was silence splitting, clean, soundless, final. Through it came darkness, not absence of light but presence of something else. From the breach descended the figure. Tall. Pale. Its gown still smoldered at the edges, and behind its translucent flesh shimmered a web of symbols, etched like runes beneath the skin. Patient Zero. Elaine shielded the child with her body, though the girl remained perfectly calm. The figure spoke, not with words but through pressure, like gravity tightening around thought. "You were preserved not for healing, but for harvesting. Your mind was rich. Your pain, ripe." Elaine trembled. "And you fed." "I was the prototype," it said. "I opened the door. I became the vessel. But the cost was identity. I remember too much. I am becoming all of you." Edward stepped forward. "Then stop. End the loop. Let her go." The figure tilted its head. "You misunderstand. I did not follow you. You came back to me." The sky rippled, and around them, more fields rose. Fields from different places, different times, each one tethered to a version of Elaine, a birthday, a funeral, a hospital room, a music recital. They were surrounded by her life. The harvest. And Patient Zero stood in the center of it all, eyes empty, yet full of her. Elaine fell to her knees. The device on her head emitted a high-pitched whine. The strain of the sync was overwhelming. Edward knelt beside her. "We have to end the loop. We brought ourselves here. We can unbind it." Elaine looked up, dazed. "How?" Edward turned to the figure. "You feed on memory. I preserve it. You consume it." A long pause. Then, "Yes." Edward reached into his coat and pulled out the stabilizer. It flickered weakly, already damaged from the previous crossing. He turned it over in his palm, his hand shaking. "Then take mine," he said. "Take what you came for." Elaine grabbed his arm. "Edward, no." He smiled. "You were the gift. I was only ever the price." Without waiting for permission, he pressed the stabilizer against his temple. The feedback was instant. A burst of images, war rooms, lovers' faces, the first time he saw Elaine play the piano, his father's hand after death, a cat they once had, a glass of water filled at midnight. All of it. Spinning. The gyroscope above reappeared, merging with the figure's form, consuming, absorbing, spiraling inward as Edward's mind unraveled. Elaine screamed. But then, something snapped. Not in the device. In Patient Zero. The figure began to spasm. This memory is not real, the harvest stuttered. This memory is constructed. Edward gasped, still conscious. Yes, he whispered. It's a forgery. A diversion. I gave you false memory. Built it myself. Weeks ago. The fields began to rot. The skies collapsed in reverse. The child on the swing vanished into ash. Elaine stared at him, eyes wide. You baited it? I'm not as helpless as I look. The stabilizer exploded in his hand. And the entire breach collapsed inward, sucking patient Zero into the spiral of false time. As it fell, it reached toward Edward not in rage, but in recognition. As if it now remembered him, too. The chamber vanished. And they awoke. Back in their home. Breathless. Cold. Whole. Elaine stood first. She looked at him, tears forming. You'll forget all of this, she whispered. I already am, Edward replied. She took his hand. Then guided him to the window. Outside, the jasmine had bloomed, early, against all logic, against the frost. And somewhere deep beneath the earth, in a vault no longer guarded by men, a machine blinked off, for the first time in 17 years. Edward no longer spoke of the breach. He moved through the hours like an automaton wound with fading memory, smiling at things he couldn't place, pausing in doorways as though forgetting why he had walked through them. He remembered Elaine's name, of that he was certain, but could no longer recall their first meeting, or the name of the estate where they'd once spent summers before the illness came. Elaine bore it all in silence. She'd expected this. The stabilizer's final burst had sealed Edward's offering, and the trade had been accepted, false memories to collapse the breach, real memories in exchange. But even a deal made with a ghost leaves a shadow. On the morning of the fourth day, a letter arrived, not by post, but slid beneath the door once more. This time, it bore a seal. A symbol either of them recognized, a circle, interrupted by a vertical line, like a keyhole or a lens. It had no address, only a single word on the flap, Archivist. Elaine opened it with steady hands. Inside was a card black and embossed with text so fine it shimmered only at angles. Your offering has been received. The breach is stable. Patient Zero is no longer viable. However, the archive remains. Access is restricted to those who remember the cost. Elaine read it twice, then a third time. Her gaze slowly drifted to Edward, who sat in his favorite chair by the fireplace, tracing the rim of an empty teacup as though it were a relic he couldn't identify. He looked up. Is it morning? He asked, uncertain. Yes, she whispered. Then, almost imperceptibly, but not the one we left behind. That evening, she opened the hidden compartment beneath the old floorboard, retrieving something she had never told Edward she kept, a drive encoded with fragments of the original research logs from Project Thalassa. Specifically, the notes written not by scientists, but by the observers. Those who claimed to dream during the trials. Those who remembered things that hadn't happened yet. Among them was a name, Dr. Mireille Oster, an ex-neurocartographer once deemed a conspiracy theorist for insisting that memory itself was not stored in the brain, but in the fabric of space-time, and the mind only accessed it, like reading from a hidden archive. Elaine had dismissed her once. She didn't anymore. The next morning, she took Edward on a walk. The path wound gently behind the house, through a thicket of pine trees that led to an overlook above the city. It was a place she had brought him once before, when they were younger, though she knew he wouldn't remember. As they reached the edge of the bluff, Edward paused. He looked out across the skyline, fingers twitching as if grasping something just outside awareness. I know this place, he murmured. But I don't know why. Elaine said nothing. Instead, she handed him the photo from Budapest. The one he had forgotten. She waited as he studied it, his eyes slowly tracing the shape of the image, his arm around her waist, her smile, the train in the background. And then something extraordinary happened. He blinked. And smiled. I bought us 2 tickets that day, he whispered, as if stunned by his own voice. One for the train. One for a concert. We never made it. Rain came early. Elaine's breath caught. You remember? Just that. His voice grew fainter. But it felt like light, behind a wall. She turned the photo over. There, in her own handwriting, was a phrase she hadn't written before. To the one who guards the breach from within. You will forget, but you will also return. She stared at it, her pulse quickening. The ink was fresh. Not her handwriting. Not quite. But familiar. Edward's gaze drifted toward the pines. Elaine, he said quietly. Someone's watching. She followed his gaze. Among the trees, motionless and silent, stood a figure. Not the specter from before. This one wore a coat, carried a leather-bound book, and had no face. Only the seal of the archivist etched into the smooth curvature where features should be. Elaine stepped protectively in front of Edward. The figure raised a hand, slowly, peacefully, and pointed. Not at them, but at the ground behind them. Elaine turned. There, etched into the dirt at the edge of the overlook, was a symbol. The same seal. And beneath it, carved in script, memory is the currency. But some accounts were never closed. The figure vanished. No wind. No sound. Gone. Elaine stood very still. And for the first time in weeks, she felt fear not for the past, but for the future. Because the archive had not been destroyed. It had only reorganized. And someone, somewhere, had just opened it again. The days that followed were silent, too silent. The house, once warm with classical music and the smell of spiced tea, now echoed with the quiet tension of something waiting. Edward's memories came in pulses, short-lived sparks that illuminated fragments of forgotten days, only to vanish before he could hold them. Each return, however brief, seemed to cost him something more. Elaine marked them in a journal. 12 instances in total. Each one linked to a photo, a phrase, a scent. But after the 12th, the sparks stopped entirely. Edward grew quieter. He no longer recognized his handwriting, or the layout of their home. He began to refer to the mirror in the hallway as the other window. She had read about this before. Late-stage dissociation from altered cognition. But none of the papers included warnings about external observers or archival intrusions from temporal breaches. On the 13th day, a small package arrived. It was made of oiled wood, carved with the archivist's seal. No note. No instructions. Elaine opened it carefully, gloves on. Inside, a single object. A key. Simple in design, silver, flat-toothed. But unlike any she had seen, it bore a second blade, twinned, slightly offset, as though it unlocked something that wasn't shaped like a door. Beneath the key was a card. This time, only 4 words were printed. Retrieve the unclaimed ledger. Elaine froze. There had been rumors, buried deep in the early Thalassa documents. Notes about a parallel operation, kept off the books even within the inner circle. Not a trial, not a treatment, but a recording mechanism. They had called it the ledger. A theoretical construct. Not digital, not physical. A construct built from collected consciousness. A library of neural patterns harvested across the breached subjects. Not just memory, but identity fragments. Elaine had dismissed it as fantasy. But now, she knew where she had to go. That night, after Edward fell asleep, his breath shallow, eyes flickering behind lids like a dreamer locked in another's dream, Elaine packed a small bag, took the key, and left. Her destination was a place she had not dared return to, the eastern annex of the Helsinki facility, long shuttered, officially condemned after a fire erased its research wing. But not all of it had burned. Beneath the annex, behind 4 sealed security doors, lay what the original map labeled Observation Room 7B. The room where the first non-corporeal transfer had allegedly been logged. Where Patient Zero's residual echoes had once been detected long after physical death. The ledger room. She arrived in the early hours before dawn. The old roads were covered in frost. Crows watched from telephone wires. The annex rose from the trees like a forgotten mausoleum, cold, lifeless, but intact. Elaine broke in through the service tunnel. The corridors stank of burnt copper and ammonia. The fire had scorched everything above ground. But the lower levels were untouched. Preserved by emergency seals Edward himself had paid to install, long before the world forgot. She descended. 1 level. 2. A stairwell with broken lights and walls lined with emergency warnings. Radiation. Memory instability. Identity leakage. Finally, she reached the vault. At the end of the hall was a single keyhole. Offset. Twin-bladed. She inserted the key. The door opened. No creak. No mechanical sound. Just the sudden absence of barrier. Beyond the threshold was nothing. A dark, circular room. In its center, a sphere. Floating. Silver and black, with lines running across it like the grooves of a vinyl record. But the grooves shifted as she watched, breathing, perhaps, or remembering. This was the ledger. It spoke without sound. There is one entry unclaimed. Elaine stepped forward. Your name is attached to it. No, she said firmly. It's not mine. I came for Edward. Silence. Then, Edward made the offering. But the breach did not consume him alone. The grooves began to spin. Faster now. Images flickered across their surface, fragments of 100 minds. Faces, places, shadows of thoughts. And then, her. Elaine. Walking through a hospital corridor. Speaking to a man in a coat. Writing in a journal. Holding Edward's hand. Her life. Her memories. Stored. No, she whispered. You have been archived, the voice replied. He merely opened the door. And then the groove stopped. A single panel on the sphere opened. Inside, a second key. Black. Warm to the touch. Elaine took it. As she turned to leave, a final message echoed from the room. To erase the debt, one must unwrite the page. Outside, the first light of morning touched the frost-covered glass. Elaine stepped into the pale dawn, unsure of what was heavier, the key in her hand, or the truth she now carried. She had gone to save Edward. But the ledger remembered her, too. The house was quiet when Elaine returned. Edward sat by the window, unmoving. The fire had long gone cold, and frost clung to the glass. Yet his eyes remained open, staring not at the world beyond, but at something behind it, as though his mind now lived in a corridor between moments. She knelt beside him. It's me, she said gently. His gaze did not shift. Not until she placed the black key in his palm. Then, slowly, his fingers curled around it. His lips moved, forming a soundless word. Unwrite. She didn't know if he meant her, or himself. That night, Elaine returned to the study. She spread the recovered documents from the ledger room across the desk. Disjointed memory fragments, identity traces, temporal coordinates. The last page bore only a symbol, the archivist's seal, now flaked and worn. She placed the black key beside it. The air around it hummed. A soft vibration ran through the floorboards. Lights dimmed. The photograph of Budapest, once forgotten, now remembered, curled in the corner, its ink bleeding backward across the paper. Their faces vanished, leaving only the station empty. It had begun. The unwriting. At first, it was imperceptible. A song Edward used to hum was gone from memory. The recipe for the rose tea they both loved faded. Then, more sharply, Elaine opened the dresser drawer and found no clothes, only folded papers, written in a language she did not speak. Reality was shedding details. Each memory unclaimed by Edward was now being unstitched from the world. She rushed to him. He sat in the same chair, but now his hair had grayed further. His hands were still strong, but his eyes held the glassy sheen of someone who had seen the end of all things. He looked at her and smiled. You came back. I always would. I remembered something, he whispered. You once told me, if I had nothing left, you would still be here. I am. But I don't know your name. A silence passed between them, so soft it trembled. Elaine leaned forward. You don't have to. Just listen. And for the first time in weeks, she sang. A melody from their youth, before the breach, before the illness. A song he had once asked her to play again and again until he'd fallen asleep in the glow of their summer terrace. His breathing slowed. And then he closed his eyes. The black key pulsed. Not violently. Softly. As if it had made its choice. It crumbled into dust in his palm. And the ledger's debt was cleared. In the months that followed, the world continued. But here and there, things went missing. A concert hall in Prague had no record of a performance it once hosted. An old research grant filed under Thalassa vanished from every university archive. And in a quiet town tucked near the forest, a modest home stood empty. No records of its owners. No taxes due. No neighbors who remembered who lived there. Only a single jasmine vine growing along the stone path. Each spring, it bloomed too early. In a place not bound by time, a sphere spins slowly. Within it are no names. Only silence. And a page, once filled, now blank. At the bottom, written in invisible ink. To love is to forget with purpose. And to remember only what matters.